work hours. Luckily, the weather is much better than earlier in the week. I think that we'd probably have a much smaller crowd if the storm was still raging. I'm Nicholas Woodsmith. I'm the Western Cape coordinator for the Campaign for Home Rule under the Free Market Foundation. My colleagues, David Nsora and Martin van Staden, the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, David, and the head of policy, Martin van Staden, have been on a roadshow starting in Port Elizabeth and culminating here in the mother city to announce the Campaign for Home Rule, a project to promote federalism in South Africa. But it is their roadshow, so without further ado, David.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and thank you to everyone for being here this morning. The Campaign for Home Rule is, I think, a beautiful and timely expression of one of the core values of the Free Market Foundation. The Free Market Foundation is a think tank dedicated to the principles of classical liberalism, so vigorous defense of individual rights and personal freedom. That also comes with personal responsibility, of course. We are, as the name suggests, capitalists, so we believe in the free exchange of goods and services in a market-based economy, free from unwarranted government restrictions and interventions. And the rule of law, the importance of people being treated equally before the law, that the laws are rational and applicable to everyone in society regardless of their status or power. That is a very important aspect of our vision for how South Africa should be. But unfortunately, in South Africa, the rule of law and also that related concept of limited government is often honored in the breach, and we want to change that. So I just wanted to give you a bit of background to the Campaign for Home Rule and why it is that we are embarking on this roadshow and this broader public policy advocacy campaign. So our diagnosis of the current situation in South Africa and the many problems that you're all familiar with is that the governance structure that exists in the country lends itself to very high degrees of political centralization. So we have enormous power invested in politicians and bureaucrats in Pretoria who make decisions on behalf of ordinary South Africans in distant parts of the country that affects their personal freedom, their ability to earn a livelihood, and the ability to secure themselves and their families and their neighborhoods and their broader communities from some of the major problems that are affecting them. So let's maybe go through a couple of noteworthy examples. So the energy crisis in South Africa, that is a direct consequence of the over-centralization of the provision and distribution of energy. The failures in Eskom, this single state-owned, vertically integrated utility, those act almost like a choke point for the rest of the economy. The problems in Eskom affect everyone. And the opposite of that would be decentralized provision of energy. We are starting to see some moves in that direction with the liberalization of energy generation capabilities, but those are still very tentative steps, and that was a reform that was foisted upon the government. It wasn't their natural instinct to do that. Another very vivid example of the failures of over-centralization is the rampant criminality that exists in South Africa and the state's inability to deal with violent crime and organized crime in particular. And I think we are here in the Western Cape, and I think that's a very vivid example of how the political appointees in the form of the police minister in Pretoria, his interests are not necessarily aligned with the interests of the people of the Western Cape. The provincial South African Police Service is ultimately responsible and reporting to the central government, and whether it's by neglect or something more sinister, the policing functions in this province have been allowed to collapse. And we see every week scores of people becoming victims of violent crime, particularly in the Cape Flats and other low-income areas. and the state is nowhere to be seen. But there are alternatives, and we will explore those. We have this paradox in South Africa that the state has as its core responsibility the protection of individual rights, the enforcement of private property rights, the upholding of the rule of law, as I mentioned. Those are really the core functions of the state, the real basics. But in the South African context, we see the state busying itself with these very extensive, highly statist and interventionist policies. So whether it's industrial policy that tries to pick winners and determine outcomes in the manufacturing sector, whether it's BE that imposes undue regulatory burden on businesses and forces them to share equity with other silent partners, whether it's labor market restrictions that prevent you from hiring and firing new workers and which drives unemployment up. All of these areas are where the state has intervened very actively and has created a lot of negative externalities, a lot of very poor outcomes. So there's the paradox. The state is not getting the basics right, but it's intervening in all these other areas to the detriment of you and I. So what we at the Free Market Foundation are suggesting is that we need a radical decentralization of power. We need to take power from Pretoria and spread it down and out to capable provinces, municipalities, and towns, right down to the smallest political unit, which is you, the individual. And our thesis is that the current constitutional structure of governance in South Africa actually is at its core a federalist structure, and that the political class in South Africa behaves as if South Africa is this unitary state. Everybody's fighting for control of Pretoria, but actually there are many areas in which power could be exercised at the lower levels of government that could actually start to solve many of the problems that we are seeing in our society. So we, at the Free Market Foundation, we've authored this paper, which you should have a copy of. If you don't already, please do grab one on your way out. And if you're watching this live stream, you can also download the paper on our website. And the paper, which our head of policy, Martin van Staden, will go into some detail about, really describes the areas in which capable, well-meaning provinces and local government authorities, but also business groups, civil society actors, can start to acquire more powers that perhaps have traditionally been more associated with the central government in Pretoria. So I just want to also speak about the political context in South Africa. We all know that there is this make-or-break election that is happening on the 29th of May. We're told that this is going to be the most significant election of a generation, at least the most significant since 1994. And for the first time, we're potentially seeing the ANC going below 50%. It's unclear just how far below 50% they will go, but the consensus, the polls suggest that for the first time it's going to lose that 50% majority. And that opens up a number of different political scenarios. And I think at this point I should stress that the Free Market Foundation is an independent non-profit organization. We're a non-partisan group, but we are very much interested and involved in the political and policy process. So we want to maximize liberty, so that's our agenda, and we're not hiding that. But we, as I say, observe the political process very closely. And there are many scenarios. The one is that the multi-party charter, the newly formed pre-electoral pact of the opposition parties, garners enough votes to dislodge the ANC. We have looked at the numbers and think that that's perhaps a bit of a long shot. It was originally called by John Steenhuisen, the leader of the DA, the Moonshot Pact for a reason, because it's a bit of a long shot. And the other alternative is also what John Steenhuisen has termed the Doomsday Coalition, where the ANC dips below 50%, but not enough to be able to cobble together, say, some rats and mice parties, and is forced to go to the EFF, which holds the balance of power, and that tilts the political orientation of the ANC towards the far left. That, I think, would be a calamitous outcome for South Africa. Bill Johnson, the political analyst, has said that would immediately trigger capital flight and the depreciation of the rand, and that coalition wouldn't potentially last very long because of that. We're a bit more cautious. We think that it would be a very serious and damaging development. So the other option is that potentially to avoid this situation, and we also now see the rise of the MK party, that Mr. Ramaphosa, who is loathed by the EFF and MK, might go cap in hand to the DA and suggest a broad coalition, which would help to keep the EFF out of power and Mkhonto we Sizwe. So these are the different scenarios, and there are potentially several other scenarios, one of which is, as Martin van Saden has written about, is a kind of a confidence and supply arrangement, an ANC minority government essentially, which the DA supports, and maybe other multi-party charter participants support as well, but they don't formally join a coalition. That's also on the table. But all of these various options, I think, are going to come with a lot of instability and uncertainty. And as we've witnessed in cities like Tshwane, the dynamics of coalition politics don't necessarily lend themselves to fundamental reform and the much needed difficult choices and trade-offs that are going to have to be made in terms of rescuing some of these failing municipalities and also provinces and the national government. So coalition politics by its very nature is going to be very unstable, and you're going to see potentially a lot of churn as well, with coalitions coming together, falling apart, coming together again, regardless of which parties participate in those coalitions. So whether it's a radical leftist outcome or a more moderate centrist MPC coalition or something in between, there, I think, is going to be a continuation of many of the trends that we've seen of decline in terms of service delivery, the ability of the state to maintain basic safety and security. Infrastructure decay is going to continue. And so it's incumbent on particularly well-administered provinces, and I think that we would all agree that the Western Cape is the best administered, and all of the Auditor General reports and other governance indicators suggest that it is the best, can start to be much more assertive in acquiring powers from the central government and start to serve the constituents who have voted them in. And so whether that entails moves to take over critical infrastructure like rail and ports, we would certainly support that. And there might be many legal opinions that might say that that's impossible, that that's the domain of the central government. But we would urge DA and other political parties that lead some of these administrations to find creative ways of trying to acquire these powers. And Martin, as I suggested, can provide us with a roadmap of that. And I think what has been very interesting in our roadshow, we started in Port Elizabeth, we then arrived in Plettenberg Bay, Knysna, George, Mossel Bay, Hermanus. Yesterday we were in Paarl, and today we're in Cape Town. Is we met with political parties, we met with business chambers, other community groups and members of the general public in each of these locations. And we were really struck by how many South Africans on the ground have already realized that nobody from Pretoria is coming to save them, that they need to be self-actualized agents of, and they need to take control of their own domain. I think very tellingly in Port Elizabeth, we were told by one of the local councillors there that there is only one patrol car of the SAPS that operates on the beachfront road at night. And that's just completely under-resourced in terms of the scale of the kind of crime that is happening there. And after dinner one night, myself and my team, we actually witnessed a robbery, somebody stealing somebody's cell phone, a pedestrian on the side of the street, right in front of our eyes. But the longer we stayed there, we also realized that some areas, some residents and businesses are starting to take advantage of mechanisms that give them the power to solve these problems on their own. So, for example, special ratings areas where you pay an additional rate or an additional levy to the council, you can then use those additional funds to install security cameras and lighting and to hire security guards. And that's what in one suburb of Port Elizabeth they did, and they managed to resuscitate a public park that had been sort of fallen into dereliction and become a hotbed of criminality. So these are the small ways in which you can start to chip away at some of these bigger problems. And in Knysna, there's been a lot of political volatility there. As I mentioned, coalitions are very unstable and can easily fall apart. And there are massive problems there with sewerage flowing into the estuary, infrastructure problems. In Hermanus, there's been a big influx of people coming through and growing informal settlements in that area, which is leading to other issues. And I think very importantly, in our travels, we met with the former mayor of Port Elizabeth, Retief Oordendaal. We met with the mayor of George, Leon van Wyk. We met with the mayor of the Overstrand municipality in Hermanus. And her name is Annelie Rabi. And so these leaders of these cities and towns are doing their best to, within the existing powers that they have, to try to improve the quality of life and the situation in the places in which they live. But the current national framework that allocates powers to them, we think needs to change it as part of the problem. There's a big financial problem that many of these municipalities rely on grants from the national fiscus. So that, I think, presents an interesting challenge. And what we're saying is that well-meaning local authorities should start to explore other mechanisms of raising money to be able to take these initiatives themselves. I think business has a big role to play there. Obviously, businesses must ensure their bottom line and still pursue the profit motive as we believe they should. But they also have resources that they can contribute towards some of these initiatives, often for their own benefit and their own self-interest. So instead of like big business associations like BUSA raising 170 million rand for a partnership initiative or a resource mobilization fund to give to the central government, they should not throw good money after bad initiatives. They should rather invest that money in successful and particularly local based initiatives rather than cleaning up the mess that the central government has made. Okay, so regardless of what electoral outcome we're going to have, the need for federalism is an urgent priority, and Martin is going to explain just some of the mechanisms in which some of those powers can be acquired. Over to you, Martin van Staden.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and thanks everyone for giving us your valuable time today. So I am the head of policy at the FMF, but I'm also trained in law. So I apologize in advance for boring you of the legalities today. Uh, but I think the first thing that David has alluded to that most people kind of find jarring, kind of almost immediately, is the statement that South Africa is a federal state and this is a federation. A lot of people have heard this idea incessantly from our senior ministers, Becky Cele, the Minister of Finance has said so, and the President Ramaphosa, who fancies himself a legal scholar, wrote a constitutional law book many years ago wherein he also says that South Africa is a unitary state. Wikipedia, of course, does also say that South Africa is a unitary state, but South Africa is not a unitary state. Because what is a unitary state? A unitary state like the United Kingdom, like Chile, like France, and like South Africa was before 1994, is a place where the central government is the source of the authority of subcentral units of government. The powers that municipalities and provinces have is entirely at the favor and generosity of the central government. So even though Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales might today have their own parliaments and executive governments, if the central UK parliament decides to repeal the legislation that they adopted to achieve that, those governments would simply overnight cease to exist. Now that is not a possibility in South Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa cannot wake up one morning and say, you know, I really want to abolish Alan Winde's government. I really don't like the things he's saying about me, and then put in some act and then take away the Western Cape's self-government. Nor can Premier Winde say that he doesn't like what is happening in Knysna or in Bitau and say that he is abolishing those municipal governments. Why? Because all these governments have constitutionally entrenched authority. That means that if you want to take away municipal authority, if you want to take away provincial authority, you have to change the constitution. That is the difference between a federation and a unitary state. In a federation, original constitutional authority exists in the constitutional document. It is higher law, as we say. And in a unitary state, it is entirely and fully a matter of discretion at the instance of the central government. South Africa is, per definition, a federal state. Now, why is this important? A lot of people think that this is nice in theory only, but we see the tangible, almost discourse results of this misconception in the way that we talk about the decentralization of political power in South Africa. Because whenever we do talk about this, we hear this other D word, which annoys me to the ends of the earth, devolution. We want devolution in South Africa. Now you can already, in the context of this term, the nature of the term here, that we are asking for something from somewhere else. We are saying, please, devolve the power down to us. Give it to us. Now that is something where the locus of control is not internal, it is external. One is powerless and one is asking for permission. And that is why the title of this booklet is Ask Forgiveness, Not Permission. Because this is a federation. This is not a unitary state where you have to plead to do the work of government. This is a place where you can do the work of government because, well, also you are in government because you were put there by the people in your municipality, by the people in your province. You are not, as in unitary states often is the case, deployed there by the central government. You were elected there by your constituency. So the work of government needs to be done. And telling your constituents, look to Pretoria, it's their problem, it's their responsibility. That might seem very legally sophisticated to you as a mayor or a premier or a councillor or a provincial legislature member in the moment, but to the desperate citizen who just needs their problem solved, it seems pathetic and it doesn't solve their problem. So there are tangible consequences to this idea that South Africa is a unitary state, and we all have to be, we being municipalities and provinces, have to be the receivers of policy from the top down rather than the originators of policy within and for our own jurisdictions. So the Constitution is a federal one. That is, if you take anything away from this event today, that is it. Now, we've been asked a few times, where does this term home rule come from? Why is this the campaign for home rule? We say as the FMF that we believe in political decentralization, and we will continue to say that. This word will keep coming up of decentralization. But what we've discovered is that the core of that word is still centralization. Decentralization means, well, the opposite of centralization, and we've decided, that's not a positive vision for what it is that we believe in. We do not accept the premise of centralization. So what has been the case around the world, and certainly in Ireland and even in Natal in South Africa in the 1950s, but also in the United States nowadays in many states, where they have this concept of home rule municipalities that get together as a municipality, almost in the same way that an SRA, a special ratings area, is established in South Africa. They form home rule commissions as the community. They adopt a home rule charter. They send that to their state government, and then that municipality becomes a home rule municipality, one that exercises general governing power within that area. And we thought really this term describes very accurately what we believe in for South Africa. And it dovetails very nicely with this principle of subsidiarity, that the people most affected on the ground, who have to live with the consequences of various issues and of various policies, they have to be able to make the decision about whether those policies, in fact, do apply there and do apply to them, to the extent that they are, of course, competent to do so. And of course, there's questions of scalability and so forth, where higher levels and spheres of government might need to become involved. So that's where this term of home rule comes from. So how then, I mean, we've had this discussion really not just on this roadshow, but over many years with legal advisors, with politicians, with their officials, in this province specifically. And there's two things that often come up. I'll start with the first one, and that's illegal. Can't do it. Sorry, just can't. And yes, yes.
The central government trying to...
Yes, yeah. I've been zapped now. But I've always found, so I'm trained in law, I'm doing my LLD in law, and the more I kind of get immersed in jurisprudence and so on, the more it becomes clear that saying, well, that's the law, it's illegal. The law is a very small term that applies to an extremely vast and majestic field of something, a very large institution. One cannot simply say it is illegal, because that's not how it works. There is a transcendent, for this context, there is a transcendent principle of law, and many of you might have heard the saying before that necessity knows no law. And we all understand this intuitively. It's not something that you have to be taught. If you're at one of these wonderful Cape Town casinos one day for an outing, and you walk into the parking lot and you see a vehicle which is locked, the windows are drawn up, and there is a child in the back of that car whose parents told him that they will be right back, but it has now been 4 or 5 hours. The child is succumbing to heat stroke. You are perfectly entitled to pick up the nearest brick and break open that car window and save the child from that car. Under normal circumstances, if you were to break open a car window, you are at the very least committing a delict for which you can be sued and for which you have to pay, or you can even be arrested for destroying someone else's property. But why is it not a crime when you break it open for the child? Because the doctrine of necessity, the defense of necessity applies. You go to court, you say, I acted out of necessity. There was no reasonable alternative to the conduct that I engaged in, illegal as it might be. And then the court will say, well, of course, what you did was legal, because that was the only way to protect the vital interests, the legally recognized interests, the legally protected interests of that child. Now, necessity does have requirements, of course. The law is not the Wild West, and If you read the booklet, you will find them listed. I must place a small rider on my invocation of the doctrine of necessity, though, and that is that it has thus far been known almost exclusively in our private law, certainly in our criminal law, which is a part of our public law, but it has been most developed in our law of delict and our civil law, and not really in our constitutional law. But it's early days. The fact is that it's only been in the last few years in South Africa, certainly in the last decade at the most, that communities and municipalities and so on have realized that the central government is a lost hope to a very large extent, and that we must do the things that need to be done. Otherwise, we're all on the Titanic going to sink together. So let's start plugging the holes. So there have been some litigation in Free State municipalities, and I'm sure if you look at the Northwest municipality, some interesting things are happening there at the initiative of the business group Sakeliga. I'm sure a lot of litigation will come out of that as well. And in some of it, you've seen echoes of necessity. We are doing this out of necessity already, even though this doctrine has not been explicitly invoked. So just bear that small rider in mind, but the next few years in South African constitutional law are going to be very interesting, I think. Now the requirements, there are 4 of them. The first is that the defendant, you as the person who broke open the window of the car with the child inside, or you as the municipality or the province that is stepping in to do something that the central government is insisting is its responsibility. You as the defendant must show that the damage that you have caused is less severe than the harm that would have resulted if you did not take the action. The second is that the defendant reasonably believed that the action that was taken was necessary to prevent the harm. The third was that there was no practical alternative to avoid the harm. Now let me stand still here for a moment, because some people have thought that what we're saying here is that municipalities must take off their kind of civil and governing hats and put on a cowboy hat and go in guns blazing. That is not what we're saying. One must exhaust the existing legal avenues to solving these problems. So South Africa has various mechanisms in the Constitution for solving these things. One of them is an intergovernmental dispute resolution. The other is, in fact, to request devolution, which the Democratic Alliance has done ad nauseum at this stage. And of course, you can go to court. But at some point, these alternatives are exhausted, and the problem remains unsolved. So that is a requirement. Exhaust the practical and reasonable alternatives, the legal routes that are available to you to solve the issue. Write as many letters as you think necessary to the minister. But at some point, the last letter has to be sent, which says, you have now an ultimatum. We have tried, and we have tried, and we have failed. And the next time we communicate, it is after I have done what I needed to do. And the last requirement, which is quite obvious for the successful invocation of the defense of necessity, is that you as the defendant must not have caused the harm in the first place. So that's relatively obvious. So this is understandably jarring to a lot of legal advisors in the Western Cape and in opposition governed municipalities, and that's fine. However, increasingly, what we as the FMF are saying there's 2 tiers kind of in government. There's the politicians, and then there's the officials. The legal advisors are part of the officialdom. What we're increasingly going to tell the politicians is that, listen, you need to appoint legal advisors who share your federalist values. You cannot run a so-called reformist government in a country that is on the verge of collapse, where you have federal principles in your political program, but then appoint staff, specifically legal advisors, who are completely opposed to your statement of values. The most kind of recent example of this, which left me certainly speechless, was when the Western Cape government introduced the Provincial Powers Bill and went on its public hearing campaign The ANC, of course, called it neo-apartheid, it's racist, fine. The ANC is perfectly consistent by doing that. They have always believed this since the 1980s. Federalism is racist, fine, they're consistent, good. But the Western Cape's own legal advisor somehow told Premier Alan Winde that this bill is unconstitutional. This is the tamest piece of legislation that anyone will ever read. It does not give anyone any power to do anything. It simply tells the premier that if you really, really want to, you can ask the president and the national government for more powers. That is effectively what the Western Cape Provincial Powers Bill comes down to. I think that's great. It changes the conversation. I think more power to the Western Cape government to adopt that bill. But that is all it does. And the fact that a fully grown LLB holder in South Africa could say that that is an unconstitutional piece of legislation in a federalist government, in a federal inclined government, is completely baffling. And unfortunately, that person must be fired. I mean, if I'm going to just come out and say it. But that person is not the only one, and there are various of these types of officials spread all over our opposition-governed municipalities who act as a handbrake on the necessary reforms to bring about stabilization and turning around the sinking ship that is South Africa. So once this conversation is had about necessity and so on, one gets to a point where it's like, okay, fine, let's accept that we can legally do these things, that we can establish a police force, that we can appoint detectives, that we can engage in prosecution. We can't afford it. There's no money for it. 95% of the Western Cape's budget comes from the national government, from the National Revenue Fund, from SARS, and they don't want to upset the purse strings, the people who control the purse strings. Municipalities have their own kind of revenue base, ratepayers get some money from the distribution of electricity, but that's not really nearly enough to do some of the big projects, the big initiatives that are necessary, the big interventions that are necessary to stop the decline in South Africa, and certainly in those areas. Now, I think this is something that's important to talk about. We don't reject that excuse out of hand. What we do find disappointing is that while the scope of local and provincial government funding is narrowed, the depth is virtually unlimited. So, as David alluded to earlier, there is at least the further one gets away from Cape Town, we've discovered in our roadshow, the further away you get from the well-governed Western Cape, the more of a willingness there is from the business community to say, well, we don't want any kind of kickbacks on this. We are willing to fork out the money to stop the decline. So in Port Elizabeth, this was very evident, where the local business community has simply started giving money, helping out, doing the job. And I asked, are they being reimbursed? Because this is also a question that often comes up. Are they being reimbursed for these services? Is anyone paying them back? No. This is all out of pocket, being funded by local business. It's just being done. This was the same in Plettenberg Bay and in Knysna, which are not DA municipalities. But the second we stepped foot in deep blue George, and from there on out, we got the distinct impression that a lot of local business entrepreneurs feel that things are well governed, things are okay. So there is no need really to start forking out some money for local initiative. And this is unfortunately quite naive, and this reluctance will need to be overcome at some stage. We can't tell anyone how to get businessmen over the line there. We have our own engagements with business on various items over things which they are very reluctant. But that is something that will need to be done, because the ruin that South Africa is experiencing is coming. It's going to get here at some point. You can only keep it back for so long. It is coming, and the local business community must be alive to that. But once this naivete is swept aside, the money is there. The money is there to do the things that need to be done. Maybe not all the things. Can't fix South Africa's whole port system, based on local business funding alone. That is not going to happen. But certainly crime. Crime is it is our biggest issue in South Africa, I think by far, violent crime. But it is perhaps one of our most solvable issues as well. In these SRA areas, we've seen virtually the elimination of violent crime overnight, the moment it is adopted. So there are these very practical steps that can be taken and are being taken in many communities to nullify South Africa's extreme rates of violent crime. And we would encourage that to start happening at scale. And that scale will come on the back of significant funding from the business community to local authorities, to provincial authorities. But failing that, to community initiatives, which the Solidarity Movement, AfriForum, Sakeliga are really the prime examples of what one can do. So I mentioned a few steps, practical steps that provincial and local governments can take in the booklet to bring about a more fully realized home rule, federal dispensation in South Africa. As I often say, we are a federation without federalism. And what I would want to see more is to pack more federalist meat onto our already federal bones. And those steps are outlined there. I'll briefly go over a few of them. The first is police. Now, I am a member of what is called the Devolution Working Group. Now, this is an institution that was established a few years ago, I think during the COVID lockdowns, by the Democratic Alliance, the Cape Independence people. I think there is the South African Agricultural Initiative is involved, AfriForum, etc., the ACDP, all broadly organizations that support federalism and decentralization. And almost from the get-go, there were 2 devolution in Dabas. I think there were 2-day events. There were hundreds of thousands of emails and WhatsApp messages and Teams calls and meetings, thousands of man-hours poured into what became a focus on the devolution of policing power. Now, we're all federalists in that group, but somehow we ended up playing this game with each other as if we didn't know that Bekitele was going to say no. We all knew Bekitele was going to say no. Of course Bekitele was going to say no to the devolution of policing power. Yet we wasted all of this time crafting resolutions that the provincial parliament ended up adopting, insisting that there must be a devolution of policing power. Letters were sent and so on, and everyone patted each other on the backs for these well-crafted letters. Of course, Bekitele said no. About a year later, Panyaza Lesufi in Gauteng wakes up one morning, yawns, and he's like, I want a provincial police service in Gauteng. Later that afternoon, they have a provincial police service in Gauteng. Wonderful. So we wasted time playing a game amongst federalists, but the centralizing Panyaza Lesufi established a police service of maybe questionable professional credentials, but nonetheless, he established it by sneezing, yet we had to play a game. So our argument now is the Western Cape can establish a Western Cape Provincial Police Service. Simple. This has been set out to the DA, to their governments. I wrote a long column for the Daily Friend about how this can be done legally. There's something in Schedule 5 of the Constitution, which is the exclusive areas of provincial legislative competence. One of the items there is provincial planning. Now, if you're a good federalist and you read that and you work in provincial government, you must obviously say that, well, it's part of my plan for the province to have a provincial police force, therefore provincial planning is the route that I'm going to go in adopting this legislation. Other things like provincial roads and traffic, etc., are also an exclusive provincial competence. These things must be interpreted broadly because South Africa is a federation. So they cannot be read as provisions in a unitary constitution, but must be read as provisions in a federal constitution. So there are mechanisms to establishing a fully fledged provincial police service in the Western Cape, complete with detectives, air support, tactical support, forensics laboratory, ballistics, all the nice things that Pretoria does not provide anymore. And this is simply, in our view, an imperative. Prosecution. Now, this is a tricky one. We have one single national prosecuting authority in South Africa. We have 86 murders, reported murders every single day in this country. We have 5 reported rapes every single hour in this country. I'm sure there's dozens more that are not reported every single hour. How is the single national prosecuting authority ever going to prosecute all of these crimes? We have a handful of high courts in this country. We have a handful of magistrates' courts. It is impossible for one institution to do this, and it is not doing it because it is, in fact, impossible. So perhaps more importantly than the decentralization of policing power is the decentralization of prosecuting authority. And we've done that. In the 1970s, we have private prosecutions in South Africa. It's not a simple thing to invoke. Private prosecutions must be done in the name of the victim of the crime. The National Prosecuting Authority must decline to prosecute. So there are various things that must be done first, but there is no reason why every municipality, why every province cannot establish its own private prosecutions unit, as AfriForum has done. The Western Cape had a private prosecuting unit for rural crimes, I believe, that it established in 2010 or 2013. The only evidence that that ever existed was a press release from the Democratic Alliance. I have never seen anything else from that unit since then. So that was not taken seriously, but it is something that can be done and should be done and must be done. And then finally, there aren't just 3 steps. I have many in the booklet, but our time is running out. Finally, and perhaps most contentiously, is that our provincial and municipal governments, those that are well-governed, staffed by well-meaning politicians who understand that government's role is to protect the liberty and property of its constituents rather than destroy the liberty and property of its constituents, they must adopt a significantly more confrontational, less compromising and less conciliatory tone with the central government. We've been told on this roadshow that adopting that tone of conciliation and of let me help you to help us, and that has worked in many circumstances, and I think be strategic, of course, do what works in the circumstances, but ultimately whenever big reforms start coming down the pipeline, we know that the central government's answer is no. And at some point, no must not be taken for an answer anymore, and rather provincial governments, municipal governments must in fact start saying no. So the Expropriation Act has just been adopted. It is waiting for the new Expropriation Act has just been adopted. It's waiting for the president's signature. In that act, it allows the Department of Public Works to expropriate private property without paying a cent in compensation. Yet our Constitution, Section 25, still provides that upon expropriation, compensation must be paid. This is an unconstitutional piece of legislation. There's various academics around the country who think that they have a good way of reading the Constitution, and that in fact, somewhere in it implicit, you can steal property without paying for it, but that is simply not the case. So what is going to happen? The central government might attempt to implement the Expropriation Act. It's an election year, and it might be quite desperate after this election to show that it has the radical credentials that it has always claimed it has had. It might try to expropriate property without compensation while that legislation is being challenged in court before a judgment has been rendered on its constitutionality. Our argument is that provincial and municipal governments must place whatever police authority they have between whoever is trying to steal that property and the property, and say, no, you will not take property in this province without paying compensation until this legislation's constitutionality has been decided upon. When the police minister, a civilian, goes onto the beaches of Cape Town harassing beachgoers in the sun with riot police telling them to go inside, where was the Cape Town Metro Police saying, excuse me, sir, you do not get to do this. Leave. We will deal with this as normal police in the normal course of our business, rather than this charade, this abuse of public authority that you are engaging in, Mr. Police Minister. Where were those authorities when that happened? Our argument is that the city of Cape Town owes its allegiance to its own people. They were put in power by the people of Cape Town, not by the central government. And they owe a duty of protection, of interposition, of nullification. They are the lesser magistrate, as Christian doctrine would say, for the people of Cape Town. They are the protector, and so is the Western Cape provincial government. So it might seem like a step away from legality, but it isn't. It is a more fuller embrace of what the law ultimately does mean, and this will lead into a lot of litigation, and I'm sure it will. But the great federations of the world, Canada, the United States, Australia, these were all forged in the courtrooms, and South Africa's federalist litigation has fallen off. We had a little bit of it in the late 90s, and nothing since then. We think it's time to pick up the mantle and start the fight for federalism once again. Thank you for your time.
Okay, we will have an opportunity for some questions from the audience. I believe there is a roaming mic, so just for the purposes of the stream, if you could use that, please. And then if you could please introduce yourself and your organization, if relevant. Any first questions to kick us off? Yes. No, in the back, sorry.
Thanks very much, that was great. Quick question on withholding taxes. Some people have tried it, I think everyone's failed. You mentioned people, I suppose, doubling up, still paying their taxes and setting up their own local institutions. Can you tell us a bit about the legalities of taking on this quite scary task?
So I can't get into any great detail on that, other than to say don't try it as an individual. I'm not going to tell you that there's anything in principle wrong with that. We've met many people saying you owe it to your fellow countrymen to continue paying your taxes. We certainly do not. We don't think along those lines. Doing it as an individual is a good way to end up in prison. So please don't try that. It's worked for ratepayers in Durban. I think they fought a court case, and I think they won that court case. So slowly but surely, I think the legal principle is to pull something like that off are being developed. I don't think we're necessarily there yet. But look, I don't want to dissuade anyone from not paying taxes. But please do it at such a large scale as you possibly can. Doing the tax revolts at the individual level are never going to pay off. The other thing I think I just want to add on to that is the double paying is going to be a reality for a while still, and people need to get very comfortable with that, unfortunately, because none of this is fair. We do not live in a fairly governed society, and for a while still we won't. So I think the pursuit of fairness must be paused, at least for a while, at least while we get the basic things that make a society functional right. We need to get crime down. We need to get water pumping. We need to get electricity in our buildings and in our businesses. Let's do all of that, and let's do that at a very large scale, even when we replace failing central government, because at that scale, then one can, in fact, go to court and say, listen, we are doing all of this for ourselves. Us paying taxes makes no rational or logical sense. And you can even start saying it's a total violation of the rule of law for us to be doing something like this when the rule of law is based on this idea of reasonableness and kind of the law making sense. Then the court might give one a hearing. But going into it now, going to court and saying, listen, I feel that it's unfair to me to be kind of paying taxes. I think our courts still have that inclination to be seen as activists for social justice. And you might have a lot of trouble doing it now. So I think give it time. Give it time, do the things that need to get done. Don't ask for any money in return for that. And then I'm certain we'll get to a point where one can start talking about saving some tax money and potentially withholding tax.
And South Africa's efforts in Jitsavala?
Yeah, well, yes, I mean, Yes, and so I think on Ditsabola it's interesting. So in some municipalities, at least at the municipal level, rates are not being collected anymore at all because they can't. The municipality has totally collapsed, so people aren't paying rates. So I guess it's easier there, in theory at least, to start doing things because you don't really have to pay rates because no one wants your money anymore. Then you start doing the work that needs to be done. In the Tabola, there's a new association being established, the Tabola Service Association, which is effectively an alternative local government. I don't think they're quite there yet. It's early days. It's still being developed. But that institution hopes to provide all the services that municipality, in theory and on paper, provides. Now, if that is successful, if the Tabola Service Association does in fact provide municipal services, I think it would be very easy really to go to court and say, listen, now that Tabola is sending us rate invoices, why would we pay that? I think it's hit or miss with the type of judge you get or the personality of the judge, but I would be surprised if you don't at some point find a judge who says, no, of course you're not going to pay rates because it's not the municipality providing the service. Not there yet, though.
Okay, good afternoon. I just want to know what is the civil society organizations doing to stop land expropriation or compensation. Another problem I don't like about the ANC is that Sylvia Lucas said load shedding was not the end of the world, which is bad, and the ANC cannot say nice things about what the DA is doing in Cape Town. You never hear Cyril Ramaphosa support what the DA is doing. It is wrong, and they're so desperate to do land expropriation without compensation, and the EFF tried to stop it in Parliament recently. If you have any issues, please let me know. I'll take it forward to the DA, and I'm an activist from the DA as well. Thank you.
Yes, so look, I think expropriation without compensation is a real risk, and we're seeing the legislation progressing. I think there will be a concerted civil society response, and I think the courts are going to be an arena of contestation. But I think it's unlikely that you're going to see expropriation in the beginning stages in places like Sea Point or Sandton, right? What you might see is in particularly some of these more vulnerable failing municipalities, local political interest groups that are aligned with radical left-wing elements starting to unilaterally, they might be emboldened by some of these, by the legislative developments to act. And I think that's why it's incumbent on some of these local groups to start, protecting their assets and their property. And I think that's going to need a really concerted response. And then you mentioned something else.
Yes, I was saying.
Oh yes, I mean, I think when Parliament burnt down, Cyril Ramaphosa said that Cape Town is a very well-run city, and thank you. But yeah, look, I mean, I think that's politics. I think the ANC is not going to want to draw attention to their opponents' successes. Paul. Yeah, maybe if we could just ask Annika if you could help with the microphone, because Joe's filming. Thanks.
He's getting a lot of exercise.
Yeah.
I'm Paul Hoffman from Accountability Now, and I'm concerned that the conversation that we've been having, interesting as it is not addressing two of the fundamental problems that we have. I hear Martin saying that we're living in a federal dispensation, but I do remember that when the Cadessa took place and the Constitution was thrashed out, the people who went there seeking a unitary state were the liberation movements. The people who went there seeking a federal state were the IFP and the Nats. They had to come to some sort of compromise between the two. And I think it's probably more accurate to say that what emerged in our Supreme Constitution is not a federal state, but a quasi-federal state. You told us that we have 95% of the money in the Western Cape comes from central government and 5% from local sources. Now, you can't say that you're in a federation when that's the way the money's working, because in politics, if you follow the money, you'll get to where you want to be quite quickly. The second point is that the difficulty with what we have is that it is not what the ANC alliance wants. The ANC alliance wants to impose the national democratic revolution on South Africa. That involves, as David said, democratic centralism. It ignores the rule of law completely. It has no respect for the separation of powers. It does not understand that anything other than hegemonic control of all levers of power in society, and when I say society, I don't mean government, I mean society, is not a way of running a country that is consistent with the constitution that we have in South Africa. And that is something that should be litigated at the highest possible level. But the other thing that worries me about the approach that we've discussed this morning, that the concept of corruption did not come into the discussion, probably because it's so obvious to everybody in the room anyway. But if it is so that the National Democratic Revolution is deploying its cadres or comrades or whatever you want to call them to unfold the National Democratic Revolution rather than to implement the Constitution, and that this has been done in ways that involve tenderpreneurism and state capture and kleptocracy and kakistocracy and all the other fancy words that we throw around when we know that people are just behaving badly, then we can stand on our heads and whistle Dixie. We're not going to get to where you would like to be, which is with the federalism in our constitution actually coming into its own. Cape Town is trying to take over the railways here. And the problem is that central government is in charge of the railways, and you're not going to prize the railways away from them by force. It has to be by agreement. Now, the mayor is threatening to have an intergovernmental dispute declared on the topic, but short of having a counter-revolution, there's no other way to do it. That's enough for now. It's only 3 points.
For now. Okay, thank you. I'll take the first question, and David will do on the second. So I've heard the term quasi-federal. It's been used quite a bit in the scholarship on South Africa. My concern with that is that slapping the term quasi onto something kind of just creates more questions than it answers. What I've adopted in my writing, at least, is to say that South Africa is a centralized federation. It's the same with the Russian Federation, I think to a large extent with India. We are a centralized federal dispensation, in the same way that the United Kingdom is a very decentralized unitary state. So what I've seen, the best kind of definition of federation is that subcentral units have their own area of competence that is constitutionally entrenched, that the subcentral units participate in national governance, so that's the NCOP, that's SELGA, and that the subcentral units cannot be abolished unilaterally by the central government. That is what I've understood to be the definition of a federal state. The finances make it extremely complicated in South Africa, but I think that's where the centralized federation comes in. And a little bit of what I said earlier about the scope of funding is limited, but the depth is unlimited. So if we allow ourselves to fantasize for a moment, if the Democratic Alliance in the Western Cape were to put together such a wonderful, credible plan to do away with many of the troubles of South Africa in the Western Cape, and some international consortium of mega businesses poured trillions of US dollars into the Western Cape, suddenly the Western Cape government would have more money than the central government. That is conceivable. It is very improbable, but it is a conceivable reality, in which case the financing thing becomes less of an issue. So it's to some extent, it's all about the grit and determination of the Western Cape government, of municipal governments, to go and get the money, to go and do whatever needs to be done, to go and find money somewhere, to do the things that they need to do. We had a very good meeting with a cryptocurrency enthusiast in Mossel Bay. We all know that, well, I think many of us think a little bit, well, crypto, it's this fad, but there's billions there. There's at least billions in treasury in crypto. And that potentially takes away many of the concerns that international finance might have with being seen to be funding a sub-central unit of the South African government. But yes, why would they want to fund it? That's a problem that the Western Cape and the municipalities would need to kind of answer for themselves. We, as the Free Market Foundation, can't provide that. So yes, I feel a little bit ambivalent about saying quasi-federal. I think it concedes something to the unitarists, and I think they do think they won something during CODESA, but I think it's important for us to avoid what the Americans have done with originalism and so on. What were the intentions of the people who drafted the Constitution? My answer is always, I really don't care. I don't care what they intended. I only care about what the text of the Constitution says and what the point of a Constitution is. A Constitution, a written constitutional instrument, exists to define the limits of government scope and power. It is an instrument of limitation, and it must therefore be interpreted as an instrument of limitation rather than an instrument of allowing government to ride roughshod over the interests of the people who live in that jurisdiction. You have some thoughts about corruption?
Yeah, Paul, thank you for your question and also for the work that you do with Accountability Now. And I think corruption is obviously a very damaging phenomenon for our economy and our society. And as you eloquently pointed out, that is an expression of the ideological orientation of the government. So corruption is not some aberration like this phenomenon that comes from without, like from the Guptas who hijack an otherwise noble liberation movement for their own pernicious ends. Corruption is an expression of the ideology of the government. It is a feature and not a bug. So you can think of similarly and analogously cadre deployment. Cadre deployment is premised on this idea of total societal control, as you mentioned. It is about capturing the levers of the state. It doesn't see the state as this neutral set of institutions where different political parties vie for their turn as administrators. The state itself is an area of contestation for political power. And so corruption is a manifestation of that. And I think there are various impulses within the Tripartite Alliance. There's obviously this large rent-seeking, patronage-driven component. There's also the ideological component, but the two are intermeshed. And I think just in terms of the DA's conduct, obviously, I mean, one of the analogies that we've drawn is that South Africa and the state of South Africa is like the Titanic. And it was cruising along and it's hit this giant iceberg of the National Democratic Revolution. And the ship is taking on water and is going to sink. And here we are in the Western Cape on the top deck of the Titanic. And the chandeliers are still glowing. And it's very warm and nice and pleasant. And the DA is sort of like the string quartet that continues to play dutifully. Yeah, and they're playing by the rules. They're doing their duty of playing their tune but the ship is sinking and they're going to go down with it. So I think it's time, and I think we don't want to turn this into a DA bashing exercise, but I think it's also time for the DA to adopt a more Machiavellian posture, actually. I mean, we've mentioned expropriation without compensation, and there's also national health insurance. There are legal teams on the ANC side who bend over backwards and twist themselves into knots to justify these policy proposals, which would inevitably be a massive violation of the rule of law and constitutionalism. I'm not a lawyer myself, but I've seen some academic lawyers try to convince the public that null compensation is different to without compensation, or zero compensation. And so, yeah, I mean, if you believe that, I have a bridge that I would like to sell you. So, yeah, I mean, here's your null compensation. I see a question in the back there. But, yeah, so as Martin suggested, the Western Cape provincial government's lawyers must start thinking of ways in which they can start to push that envelope. We can't necessarily prescribe how to do that, but the law follows politics. And maybe that's a legal realist position. But, I think that building political power is the way to do this. And, in the back there.
Hi, my name is Vunene Shilubane. I am from Bedprop, but I'm asking this more from a personal capacity. I understand a lot of the discussion has been around the more logical and practical steps behind house rule, and I wanted to ask a more softer question. I don't feel very apt to speak to the more legal and practical elements of it, but something like house rule, have you assessed it through the lens of cultural like how to be culturally accepted in the spaces that you want to implement this in? Because and please, with all due respect, it seems a little bit culturally elitist to kind of give the implication that people in the space would know how to run it in the best way possible, and how do you not essentially rebel against, or have the people who, because you're saying it's down to the individual, not basically go against that definition of house rule? And then also having elements, have you studied the more practical expressions of what I would kind of deem as like an individual house rule in the more informal spaces in Cape Town or in South Africa? Like in the township, have you observed how people essentially implement the practical elements of some of what you've described, but without the more defined, legal steps that they've taken, like individuals who have set up their environment so that they serve themselves because they know the municipality and their government, etc., doesn't serve them. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think we would encourage all South Africans, regardless of their cultural context or their income level, to start adopting some of these proposals. I mean, I think what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal, I think is, in the run-up to this election, is going to be hugely consequential for the future of that province and the country more broadly, with the political changes that are happening there. And, we saw in KwaZulu-Natal the violence that beset, during the 2021 riots, that affected many different communities. And, you had community policing forums, neighborhood watches. Where those structures existed, they were able to protect their businesses and their livelihoods and so on. And I think that was across the kind of racial spectrum, right? And then, I think very importantly is that this idea of voluntary free association. So we're not saying that, we're not prescribing how groups should be classified or how they should structure their affairs, but we're encouraging people to come together where there's mutual self-interest and kind of common bonds to really strengthen that.
Yeah, so I mean, we really are taking this from a real perspective of real anti-elitism. That's the point, because we believe that the kind of the elitist instinct is to say, well, I know what's best, and everyone has to kind of fall in line with that because, well, I'm me and I have all these degrees and they're them. But home rule really is this recognition that however a community decides to kind of structure itself and define itself, even, as David says, voluntarily, it's ultimately up to them how to do the things that need to be done there. Because we, as a relatively small organization in Johannesburg, cannot possibly know the issues that are occurring in these areas, in these communities. But that's even more true, really, for the central government. That's even more true for, in some cases, provincial governments. Less true for municipal governments, but our municipalities are huge in South Africa as well. One must also think about that. I was quite astounded by how large the Overstrand local municipality was. We were looking across the bay at Gansbaai, and I was like, yeah, it's a different municipality, but apparently it's one large local municipality. So we have a lot of government by others in South Africa rather than government by our own community. So that's certainly our intention to bring that about. And we're followers in this case. We didn't start this trend really that's getting going in South Africa to a very large extent now of doing things themselves. I mentioned earlier AfriForum and the Solidarity Network have in their own communities really set the example for how to do that. But South Africa's townships have long resisted the idea of being dictated to by central government. This is something that's from the 80s, and we saw this most clearly during the COVID-19 lockdown. While we in the suburbs were cowering in our houses, hiding under the tables, life was carrying on in the townships. No one there said we will just fall in line with what we're being dictated to by the central government. So the natural or instinctual desire to govern oneself has already found its practical manifestation in South Africa. Our agenda is to tell these communities, listen, what you're doing is not wrong, because that ambivalence is still there. When local communities start doing things, we still find that the organizers are like, well, I don't really know whether we should be doing this. Maybe the municipality should be doing this. I'm not really sure. And because we take personal and community responsibility so seriously, our answer is no. Even if tomorrow or the 29th, a new government comes to power and it's the best thing ever, it's some Norwegian or Swedish government or whatever that kind of just does everything properly, it's still better for your community to take ownership of the things that affect you and to do it from within the community, because then it's yours. You take it more seriously, you take care of it, you maintain it. That's the results of taking responsibility, and that's something we want to encourage even if things get better in South Africa, because even though it's been socialism and the NDR that's led us to this point, at a more abstract level, it's because we've ceded responsibility for centuries, really, as people, to the state. We've decided that, well, we don't really want to do X anymore. Let's give it to some politicians, and they'll take care of it. And sometimes it works, but when they stop taking care of it, we've lost our sense of responsibility, and now we don't know what to do. But now South Africa is regaining that, and that's actually an incredibly inspiring story, and we're catching up, really, to the trend.
So Neil and then Rod and then France, and then I think is that Polani and then Solana. Okay.
Hi, good morning. It's Neil Emmerich. I mean, while we have things like legal separation of powers, we've seen through party allegiance how that can be watered down. I mean, Paul gave an example. If the DA are invited into central government, do you think that's going to scuttle the sort of federalist motivation?
Well, well, we have a DA representative here who can maybe, but actually what we're saying is we don't want to be prescriptive, but I suppose we are. If there is some broader coalition that takes place, the DA shouldn't just do it for some kind of abstract national patriotic impulse. It should be it should play hardball and say, well, if you need us to keep you in power, these are our conditions. You need to give us the authority over the port. You need to cede the control over the provincial railways. And that, I think, should be a very important bargaining chip on the table for its participation. And that's sort of what I was talking about with the Machiavellian approach, to say, okay, well, we need some conditions for our collaboration.
Add to that. So even if all of South Africa were governed by one party, by the ANC, for instance, if we had a first past the post system all over the show, we would still be singing the same song, because federalism is not just the ability to succeed It's also the allowance to fail. And that's one of the messages we've been giving to the DA in particular. It's that if you truly believe in this federalist principle, this idea that we want to do things properly to govern well, the federalist principle applies in the other direction as well. We want to be able to govern poorly and fail as a result of that. We don't have that in South Africa, because even though most of our municipalities have collapsed, I mean, people still live there and things are still happening there. And that is because there's this unbreakable link with the province and with the center, where these bailouts keep coming, and then this institution writes off municipal debt and so on. That sense of responsibility is not vesting. So even if the ANC or any other party had a total monopoly on political control here, we would still say there must be a federal decentralization so that failure means something real, political in those circumstances. So it wouldn't scuttle it. It would certainly make it slightly more difficult, and it would introduce complications, but we would still be singing the same tune. Thank you.
Yeah, failure is part of the process, but it's important is who bears the cost of the failure. So at the moment, municipalities owe Eskom 50 billion rand. There's no way that some of these municipalities are going to be able to pay that. And so at some point, maybe National Treasury will come in and write off that debt, but somebody will bear that cost. It'll be diffused through the system. So much more important to have that strong local level accountability. All right, Frans, and then we'll go to Rod.
Thank you. Frans Rautenbach. I wrote a book called Help Yourself South Africa, which proposes a slightly alternative or an additional strategy, if you like, where I work with the idea of private agreement and private property. Now, not very far from here, there's a housing estate, Mount Edgecombe, which established its own traffic rules. And because it was situated on private property, the Supreme Court of Appeal ruled that being in charge of your own property entitles you to make rules like that. Now, if that is a correct principle, which I think it is, if you take property seriously, you must. Then I think you can use the principle of property to institute private provision of housing, private provision of health rules, private provision of employment. Employment you do by way of private agreements working around the restrictions of our labor law, which, as we know, is one of the biggest restrictions of progress in South Africa.
And you wrote a book about that as well.
I wrote a couple of books about that, and I still think that, Martin, a close contender to crime must be employment.
Absolutely.
People are, and they work hand in hand too. I mean, crime is just an alternative way of getting employment.
Yes.
But I think private properties, and ultimately I see the dream of a little town which is privately based. Not quite in Orania, because I don't think you want the racial exclusivity of Orania, but the principle there is private property, private agreements, and you demonstrate, because that is why federalism is a good idea. It's the power of demonstration. The one reason we're even talking about this is because we're sitting in a province which has demonstrated the benefits of reform. And I think if you can set up those examples of reform, that's what happened in China when they did the free economic zones. People suddenly saw, oh, now I see how it works. So I think privately based projects and towns ultimately, with electricity, with manufacturing, with education, private education. Once people see the benefits, there will be a groundswell support. So I think that's an additional strategy that can work.
Yeah, and look, when I was a boy, my family moved into Fourways Gardens in Johannesburg. And at the time, that was quite a novel concept, a gated community. But now, all throughout Johannesburg, there are different kinds of secure living arrangements, whether that's a townhouse complex or it's just a question of the scale. But I think your broader point is about how did communities detach themselves from this state dependency and also take advantage of economies of scale, right? So, whenever you fly in to Cape Town or Joburg, you now see lots of solar panels on households' rooftops or businesses. But that's really a modular solution. That's something we would celebrate and encourage. But we would like to see much more scaling up of these solutions to state failure, as to borrow a phrase from Sakiliga. So I think those kinds of arrangements really enable those economies of scale to take place. If you can have water reticulation services instead of a JoJo tank, if you can have private energy generation, I mean, I think the potential that exists in South Africa in terms of human capital and resources is limitless. I mean, I think we often just assume that low growth is sort of this inevitable thing, but it's not. We have really incredible potential, and it goes back to the lady's question at the back there. We're seeing now in Soweto people starting to have access control areas and starting to gate off certain areas of that township and try to fix some of the overwhelming problems affecting that community. So it's not just an elite middle class concern anymore. I think a lot of other groups are doing that as well.
And you bring up the Orania example. I mean, say what you want about their politics, that's kind of irrelevant. The fact is they have a very important model, an important template that is extremely useful, and that is kind of that would be the easiest way to implement like real practical home rule. And yeah, I mean, what is Orania if not a large gated community? Really, there's no wall, there's no gate, but that's effectively what it is. And it's not lawless. It's still within South African legal kind of application, so the protection of civil rights and so on still continues apace. But the basics, which is really what we're really talking about here, the basics, water, electricity, crime prevention, all of those things are taken care of, because with the ownership of property comes that totally unavoidable incentive to protect that property, to secure it against predation and against abuse. And yeah, we at the FMF are very big on privatization. So if someone asks, well, maybe we should privatize some neighborhood roads and put the local kind of suburb in charge of that area, we're all there. We're there for it. So absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And needless to say, the Free Market Foundation has been a champion of private property rights. We mentioned that we've been very resistant to expropriation without compensation, but we also believe in extending this right, which is a natural human right, to all South Africans. That's why we're very proud of the work that we've done with the Kaya Lum project to get title deeds into the hands of deserving South Africans, disadvantaged South Africans. And we're very proud that we've transferred over 13,000 of these title deeds to date, which is just one step amongst many to ensure that all South Africans benefit from private property rights. Yes, Rod.
Rod McPhail. Just one brief point. You said at the beginning that private enterprise or capitalism is one of the ways of doing things, but in fact, I think all countries are capitalist. It just depends whether you think a state official who has no skin in the game is better than a private individual who has. But my real point is just to show that this is not elitist. I have been trying to develop a transport hub between Makassar and Khayelitsha for the benefit of those communities. I have a client who has been pressing me hard to get going with this thing, and it took us 3 years to find out which organ of government controlled the little piece of land that we need a servitude of 120 meters. We have the main land to do all the work, but we just need a servitude. We started by an application in December 2021, and we were put on the President's critical infrastructure list because we didn't need any money, we just need a stroke of the pen. Since then, I've had 3 meetings with the minister, face-to-face, Sikalala, One in Johannesburg, one here about 6 months ago, and then a few weeks ago, briefly, I met him in the airport and I buttonholed him when I was there. I cannot believe that something which is for the benefit of two communities that badly need transport, safe and efficient transport, and we could provide that with private money, and the company who's involved is 82.28% black-owned, cannot get through the quagmire. In 2022, it was already approved by the local Department of Public Works, and yet they're still fiddling around with it in Pretoria. One wonders what they do.
I mean, you just provide a very clear example of how subsidiarity is not being respected. I mean, you have permission from the local communities themselves, obviously. You have permission from the local government. But now you're waiting around for permission from someone who has no kind of vested interest or no skin in the game of what happens around that area. So it's completely bizarre. And while I'm not giving you legal advice now, our answer in the abstract would be to just do it, and after it's done, ask for forgiveness. As they say, possession is 9/10 of the law. So,
Right, I think we have time for one more question from Zolani in the back there.
Hi guys, this is Zolani. Sorry for being late. It's election year, so politicians, they're all fighting.
That's what they
for
do.
our attention. But Zolani from Argus. I just want to ask, I understand the whole concept of federalism, but in the historical context or the historical political context of many African countries, you know, they are striving, you know, to advance the communities of those who are historically disadvantaged and so on. You remember that we're coming from history of colonialism and apartheid and so forth. So my question is that wouldn't federalism advance the communities that are already advanced, you know, leaving away the communities that are, you know, that are still, you know, that are still have to go through, get through. So the reason of central government, you know, that this community depend on central government, because they don't have funds, money to even to start building their lives, you know. That's why we've got these RDP houses and what and so forth. So my question is, it centers around that, you know, would these historically disadvantaged communities not suffer more, you know? Because I understand if you say in Constantia, we're closing the road there, you know, and in Kailicha, they don't have the means to close the roads, you know. And also, I don't have a problem. Of course, as a journalist, I shouldn't say I don't have a problem, but wouldn't a mixed economy be, you know, be appropriate instead of fully going to the left and fully go to the right? Wouldn't a mixed economy, you know, be an ideal in this situation where we're seeking to advance to utopia, you know? So couldn't we just, because I mean, if you look at the political history of Africa, of many African countries, you know, I think many of countries started to gain freedom in 1960, I think so. So it's quite a very short time, you know, to impose these. I mean, these people need. I mean, they grew up in this, in a sense of communalism, and then, you know, they need to, you know, now we're still trying to figure out what is democracy, you know, and we haven't got an idea of really what democracy means, you know. That's why many of our people are quite corrupt, because they still, but wouldn't, because we are really playing around with the idea of democracy now. We really haven't figured out yet. So I'm sure we figured out, but in my opinion, I think we haven't. But so that's my question, yeah.
Okay, yeah, there's quite a lot there, and I'll try and unpack it. So I think South Africans tend to be self-obsessed. We like to stare at our own navels. And so it's very good that you brought up some of these other African examples. My wife is Kenyan, and I go up to Kenya frequently. And in Kenya, a few years ago, I think it was around 2010, they actually initiated constitutional changes. And those changes introduced much more devolution of power and more federal mechanisms. And what you've seen in Kenya is that there's been a flood of capital and expertise out of Nairobi and into some of these outlying regions. And Kenya doesn't have the same kind of hang-ups as it in terms of racial issues. Like, when you go there, no one really talks about the legacy of colonialism. But the legacy of ethnic sectarian conflict is very high. And so for many years, there's been this struggle over capturing the center. And there's a book called It's Our Turn to Eat, and it's about how all of these elites vie for control of the center and then just pillage as much as they can when they're in power. But devolution and federalism has the power to create alternative poles of power and resources. And so that's why, I mean, my wife is a Luhya speaker, and in Western Kenya, where her family's from, you're now seeing a lot more growth and establishment there. So federalism is something that benefits everyone. And in South Africa, many high-income people are able to invest in protecting themselves and so on. But who are the real victims of the failures of central overreach? It is the poor. It's the 63 people who die in a week in the Cape Flats in gang violence. It's people who get cholera because the water system is failing in KwaZulu-Natal. So I think with respect, the current system has showed that it is broken, and the current system is actually a mixed system with extensive state overreach. And I think the problem with the mixed system, it's sort of like tiny little drops of poison in a pond, and the first few or so drops you don't get affected, but at some point you start to poison the whole water system. And so we need to purify that water, get the state out of people's private lives and out of their businesses, and start to create real growth and prosperity for everyone in this country. Yeah.
So one of the quotes in this context that I'm often fond of using, Donald Horowitz wrote in 1991, right, kind of just during the transition, that federalism tends to remain the wisdom of hindsight in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, only. Because all the colonial kind of decolonizing efforts tended to produce unitary states. And that has not solved the problems. And certainly in South Africa, centralization was built, certainly by Kader Asmal, Albie Sachs, all these individuals who engaged in legal thinking around the structure of the Constitution during those days. We were told, I wasn't around back then, but South Africa was told that this is going to lead to a cross-subsidization, it's going to uplift poor communities, and we'll all kind of lift up, and that story just never happened. What we were promised, the benefits of the centralized state that we were promised in South Africa, that the poor communities were sold, simply never came to be. Trillions of rands has been sucked up into our tax system, and trillions have been looted and stolen and really wasted. Even where there were attempts at development programs, it was just done in such a way that it simply did not work because of various other ideological factors that just go hand in hand with the socialist sentiment, which is to deploy loyal comrades to the cause rather than someone who can actually administer the program that you have designed. So centralization has not paid the dividends that we were told it would. And as far as we are concerned now in South Africa, where we are in a state of collapse, where, I mean, we've had a few days without load shedding now, and the diesel is probably starting to run out, I'm sure. But this is not normal for a country that is so, we live in an era of plentiful electricity that we're struggling with this. We had water infrastructure that worked, and now suddenly it's simply not working anymore because it hasn't been maintained. The honeymoon period of centralization, I think, is over. The centralists have had their chance, and they squandered it in large part. So as far as we at the FMF are concerned, is you had your chance. This is what we say to the ANC and people who think like that. You had your chance, and it didn't work. But kind of to allay fears, I mean, there's nothing about federalism that would stop cross-subsidization. Certainly not. So if that is the fear that Khayelitsha and Soweto would be left without resources, that is certainly a legal step, and we might have a long debate and concerns about such a step. But one could say that one of the prices of federalism, of federal decentralization, is that there must be a degree of cross-subsidization to poorer areas. That is absolutely a step that can be considered and a step that can be taken. And I think our previous CEO, Leon Lowe, wrote a book, South Africa, The Solution, in the 1980s, where he advanced the idea for a canton, Swiss canton system in South Africa. It was quite influential during those days, and if you read the Constitution, you can see many of the influences. But it's not like that argument was ever that we must cut off the poor areas and let the rich kind of become islands. It was in fact recognized already in the 80s that each of these cantons would basically have black majorities, really, and that still the benefits of federalism would accrue in those areas. And something that's not often remembered is that for some reason we remember that the NP, the National Party, was federalist. The National Party was not federalist. The National Party became a federalist party in I think in October of 1991 at its Bloemfontein Congress, and it stopped being a federalist party, I think, early the next year when the negotiations started, and it's conceded the federal principle. In South Africa, federalism has always been the political creed of those who opposed apartheid, not of the ANC, so centralism was also there, centralization. But the ruling Afrikaner elite, the benefiting English elite were never federalists, really, except for Natal for a brief moment.
And the IFP has a long
Of course. From the 1970s, the IFP has been one of the foremost federalist entities in the country, and of course the Progressive Party and the Liberal Party of the 1960s and 70s became leading federalist advocates. So federalism has been an anti-authoritarian creed, and it has never been really used to, as an excuse to embed racial privilege and so forth, because it just won't work. South Africa's demographics do not lend themselves to having these small white federalist islands of racial privilege. It's just banish the thought. It won't happen. So federalism really is something that will benefit everyone. And then just a short point on the mixed system. Every country in the world is a mixed system. There is, I think, North Korea probably also has some small elements of capitalism and private property at a very kind of small level. But when you look at the two major global indices of economic freedom, they look at all the countries, and they show that the less of a mixed system you are in favor of a free system, of a free and open market, the better the outcomes are for everyone, especially the poor. In countries that have fewer economic restrictions, fewer government programs, the poor earn up to 8 times more than the poor in countries that have more generous governments, more interventionist governments. So it is almost without exception that more socialist countries do worse on human development outcomes than more capitalist countries. There is no capitalist country in the world, there is no socialist country in the world, but the more capitalist you are, the better you do without exception, and the more socialist you are, the more centralizing you are, the worse you do without exception. The Nordic countries are all said to be the socialist countries, but these are welfare states funded by very, very prosperous capitalist economies. So our view is we want a free market system. We do not want a social market system. We do not want a watered down version of the market system. But we will take any steps and any step in favor of a more free system because it just pays in every context. And you don't have to ask us, ask the people of Cuba whether they want to live in the generous Cuban state or in the cowboy capitalist Florida. They will choose Florida. If you went back in time and you asked the people of East Germany whether they want to live under the generous benevolence of their socialist government or they want to live in the West, in the capitalist state, they will always say, we want to go that way.
They had to build a wall to keep them in.
They had to build the wall. There's always one-way traffic. The traffic is always from North to South Korea. The traffic is always from East to West Germany. The traffic is always from Cuba to Florida. The traffic is never in the other way. The Zimbabwe to South Africa, the Soviet Union into Europe and into the West. The poor know better than anyone else what works. So let's ask them.
Well, I just wanted to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy days to come and hear our message for Home Rule. This is the beginning, not the end. So we have established a website, homerule.org.za, where you can follow our work and our progress. We hope to do more roadshows in the future and to be sharing through our writing and other media outputs some more of these ideas. And I think this idea of federalism is a timeless one, but its time is now in South Africa. So we will be around, so please do join us for a cup of coffee or some snacks if you have any follow-up questions. But otherwise, thank you for coming and stay free.
Just before we break up, Nicholas has got his itching to share some news with us. Yeah, I'll leave it to him, please. Pardon me, everybody else?
Sorry, this is actually that Martin's recently won an award